October 9th, 1514, Cluny Abbey, France, 3 a.m. The 70-year-old King Louis XII of France was found dead in his bed, his young English bride of barely 3 months sleeping peacefully beside him. The 18-year-old Mary Tudor, sister to England's mighty Henry VIII, awoke to find herself a widow before she had barely begun to be a wife. But as the French court whispered in hushed tones about the king's sudden demise, a far more scandalous question hung in the perfumed air of the royal chambers. Had the beautiful English princess murdered her elderly husband? The official cause of death was given as excessive exertion in the marriage bed, a diplomatic way of saying the old king had died trying to satisfy his teenage bride. But courtiers who had observed Louis's robust health just days earlier began to whisper of poison, of English treachery, and of a conspiracy that reached all the way back to the Tudor court in London. Have you ever wondered how a single secret marriage could bring down the most powerful royal family in Europe? Tonight, I'll reveal the shocking truth behind Mary, Tudor's forbidden love affair, a scandal so explosive that it nearly destroyed the Tudor dynasty and changed the course of English history forever. What makes this story even more extraordinary is that Mary Tudor didn't just defy her brother once. She committed the ultimate act of royal treason by choosing love over duty, passion over politics, and personal happiness over family loyalty. The consequences would echo through the halls of European courts for decades. The Golden Princess of England, Mary Tudor, was not just any royal sister, she was Henry VIII's most beloved sibling, the jewel of the Tudor crown, and arguably the most beautiful princess in all of Europe. Born in 1496, she had grown up in the splendor of the English court, educated alongside her brother Henry in languages, music, and dancing. Where Henry was imposing and commanding, Mary was graceful and charming. Where he was calculating and political, she was spontaneous and passionate. Contemporary accounts describe a woman who could stop conversation simply by entering a room. The Venetian ambassador wrote to his doge, "The Princess Mary is the most beautiful creature I have ever beheld. Her hair is of the finest gold, her complexion like roses and lilas, and her figure so perfectly proportioned that she seems carved by the hand of God himself." But Mary's beauty was not just physical, it was political. In an age when royal marriages were the foundation of international diplomacy, a beautiful princess was the most valuable commodity a king could possess. Henry VIII understood this perfectly, and from childhood he had planned to use his sister's charms to secure the most advantageous alliance possible for England. The relationship between Henry and Mary was complex and intimate. They had been raised together after the deaths of their older siblings, creating a bond that was both protective and possessive. Henry genuinely adored his sister, but he also saw her as an extension of his own power, a living symbol of Tudor magnificence that could be deployed wherever English interests required. His Majesty speaks of the Princess Mary with such tender affection, noted Thomas Wolsey, Henry's chief minister, in his private correspondence. Yet he watches her with the intensity of a hawk guarding its most precious prey. I fear he will find it difficult to part with her when the time comes for marriage. The French Gambit, an old king's last hope. By 1514, the geopolitical situation in Europe had created the perfect opportunity for Henry to deploy his most valuable diplomatic weapon. France and England had been locked in a complex dance of alliance and enmity for centuries. But the current situation required a new approach. Louis XII of France, despite being in his 70s, was desperate for a male heir to secure the succession of his kingdom. Louis's situation was precarious. His previous marriage to Anne of Brittany had produced only daughters, and French law prevented women from inheriting the throne. If Louis died without a male heir, the crown would pass to his cousin Francis of Angoulême, a young, ambitious prince who represented everything the aging king distrusted about the new generation. The solution seemed obvious. Louis needed a young, fertile wife who could give him the son he so desperately required. And Henry VIII had exactly what the French king needed: a beautiful 18-year-old sister, whose proven Tudor bloodline suggested she would be capable of producing healthy male heirs. The negotiations for Mary's marriage to Louis XII were conducted with the secrecy and precision of a military campaign. Both courts understood that they were orchestrating not just a wedding, but a complete realignment of European power. If Mary could produce a male heir for France, it would create an Anglo-French alliance that could dominate the continent for generations. But there was a problem that neither court wanted to acknowledge publicly: the extreme age difference between the proposed bride and groom. At 70, Louis XII was old enough to be Mary's grandfather. Worse still, his health had been declining for years, making it questionable whether he would live long enough to father children, let alone raise them to adulthood. The secret opposition, Charles Brandon's dangerous love, while Henry and Louis negotiated the terms of Mary's French marriage. A far more dangerous relationship was developing in the shadows of the English court. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, was everything that Louis XII was not: young, handsome, athletic, and desperately in love with the princess he could never hope to marry. Brandon was Henry's closest friend, a relationship that had developed during their shared youth at court. Born into minor nobility, Brandon had risen through a combination of martial skill, political cunning, and sheer charisma. He was the kind of man who could joust with princes in the morning and seduce their wives in the evening, a dangerous combination of abilities that made him both invaluable and threatening to established power. Relationship between Mary and Brandon had been developing for years, hidden beneath the elaborate formalities of court life. They had danced together at royal festivities, exchanged glances during state ceremonies, and found moments of private conversation in the maze of corridors and secret chambers that made up the Tudor palaces. What made their attraction so dangerous was not just its passion, but its equality. Unlike the political marriages that dominated royal life, Mary and Brandon were drawn to each other as individuals rather than as symbols of dynastic power. They shared interests in music, literature, and the new humanist learning that was transforming European culture. "I have observed the Duke of Suffolk in the presence of the Princess Mary," wrote the Spanish ambassador in a coded dispatch to his king. "His behavior is correct in every particular, yet there is something in his manner that suggests deeper feelings than mere courtly respect. I fear this attachment may complicate the French negotiations." The ambassador's fears were well-founded. As the date for Mary's departure to France approached, both she and Brandon understood that they were facing a separation that might last for the rest of their lives. If Mary successfully married Louis and produced heirs, she would be bound to France forever. If she failed to produce children, she might find herself trapped in a loveless marriage until the old king's death freed her. The wedding that shocked Europe. The marriage ceremony between Mary Tudor and Louis XII took place on October 9, 1514, at Abbeville, with all the magnificent pageantry that two of Europe's most powerful courts could provide. Mary arrived in France, accompanied by a retinue of English nobles and ladies, her trousseau reportedly worth more than the annual income of entire kingdoms. The visual contrast between bride and groom was shocking, even by the standards of royal political marriages. Mary, at 18, was in the full bloom of her beauty and vitality. Louis, at 70, was frail, bent with age, and required assistance to complete the wedding ceremony. Contemporary accounts describe guests who struggled to hide their dismay at the obvious mismatch. The King of France appeared so aged and infirm that many wondered whether he would survive the wedding feast, recorded the English herald who attended the ceremony. Her Grace the new Queen maintained her composure with admirable dignity, but those who knew her well could see the cost of her sacrifice in the tightness around her eyes. The wedding night became the subject of immediate speculation and eventual scandal. Palace servants reported that the new queen emerged from the royal chambers the following morning pale and withdrawn, while the king appeared unusually animated and boastful about his martial prowess. Within days of the wedding, Louis began displaying behavior that alarmed his physicians and courtiers. The elderly king, who had been content with a quiet routine in his final years, suddenly demanded to participate in tournaments, hunting expeditions, and elaborate court entertainments. He seemed determined to prove that marriage to a young wife had restored his youth and vigor. The rapid decline. What happened in the weeks following the royal wedding has been debated by historians for centuries. The official French court records describe a king who was energized by his new marriage, but who pushed himself beyond the limits of his aged body. Private accounts suggest something far more sinister. Louis XII had always been moderate in his habits, eating simple foods, retiring early, and avoiding the excesses that characterized many royal courts. But after his marriage to Mary, his behavior changed dramatically. He began consuming rich foods, staying up late for entertainments, and engaging in physical activities that would have challenged men half his age. The transformation was so rapid and complete that some courtiers began to whisper about unnatural influences. Had the English princess brought potions or enchantments to stimulate her elderly husband? Was she deliberately encouraging behaviors that would exhaust his remaining strength? More disturbing were the reports from the royal chambers. Servants spoke of the king's insatiable demands for his young wife's attention, his desperate attempts to prove his continued virility, and his growing paranoia about rivals who might steal Mary's affections. His most Christian Majesty has become like a man possessed, wrote the Duke of Longueville to his wife. He speaks constantly of his English queen, watches her every movement with jealous intensity, and works himself into exhausting frenzies, attempting to satisfy what he imagines are her expectations. The French court physicians were alarmed by Louis's condition, but powerless to intervene. Royal prerogative allowed the king to ignore medical advice, and his new wife's presence seemed to make him immune to concerns about his health. The mysterious death on the morning of January 1st, 1515, less than 3 months after his wedding, Louis XII was found dead in his bed. The circumstances of his death immediately sparked controversy that would persist for centuries. The official cause was listed as apoplexy brought on by excessive conjugal exertion. A euphemistic way of saying the old king had literally died, attempting to satisfy his young wife. But this explanation satisfied few observers, particularly those who had witnessed Louis's dramatic behavioral changes in the weeks before his death. Several factors made the death suspicious. First, Louis had been examined by physicians just days before his death and declared to be in reasonable health for his age. Second, the rapid deterioration that preceded his death was unlike the gradual decline typically associated with apoplexy. Third, and most damning, was the fact that Mary Tudor showed no signs of grief or shock at her husband's sudden demise. The Queen Dowager received news of His Majesty's death with remarkable composure, reported the English ambassador. She expressed appropriate sorrow for the loss of her husband, but her manner suggested relief rather than genuine grief. One might almost think she had been expecting this outcome. The suspicions were fueled by Mary's immediate actions following Louis's death. Rather than observing the traditional period of mourning, she quickly began making arrangements for her return to England. More scandalously, she sent urgent messages to certain English courtiers, messages whose contents were never revealed but whose recipients included Charles Brandon. Seeds of scandal as France mourned its dead king and prepared for the coronation of the young Francis I. Mary Tudor found herself in a unique and dangerous position. As the Dowager Queen of France, she was entitled to a substantial pension and considerable independence. She was young, beautiful, wealthy, and for the first time in her life, free to make her own choices. The question that haunted both the French and English courts was simple. What would Mary do with her newfound freedom? The answer would shock Europe and create a scandal that would reverberate through the Tudor dynasty for generations. Because Mary Tudor, the golden princess who had dutifully sacrificed herself for political necessity, was about to commit the ultimate act of royal rebellion. But before she could claim her freedom, she would have to survive the dangerous game of international politics that her husband's death had set in motion. France wanted to keep her as a valuable political asset. England wanted her back as a potential bride for another advantageous alliance. And powerful factions in both countries were already plotting to control her future. What none of them understood was that Mary Tudor had already made her choice. The secret messages she had sent to England weren't just communications. They were invitations. And the man she had summoned to France was about to help her commit an act of defiance that would change the course of history. The stage was set for the greatest royal scandal of the Renaissance. The question wasn't whether Mary would choose love over duty. It was whether she would survive the consequences of that choice. February 14th, 1515, Dover Harbor, England. Midnight. Under the cover of darkness, a single ship slipped quietly from the English harbor, carrying the most dangerous passenger in King Henry VIII's court. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, stood at the vessel's bow watching the French coastline approach, knowing that he was embarking on a mission that could cost him his life. Officially, he was traveling to France as Henry's ambassador to negotiate the return of the Dowager Queen. Unofficially, he carried secret letters from Mary Tudor, letters that contained an invitation that would change both their lives. Forever. The irony was devastating. Henry VIII had chosen his closest friend to bring back his beloved sister, completely unaware that he was sending the one man in England who could never be trusted to complete that mission. Brandon's ship carried diplomatic credentials, official instructions, and royal authority. But hidden in his personal belongings was something far more dangerous, a marriage contract that would make him the most hated man in Europe, the widow's gambit while Brandon crossed the treacherous February waters of the English Channel. Mary Tudor was playing the most complex political game of her life. As the Dowager Queen of France, she found herself at the center of a diplomatic storm that threatened to tear apart the careful balance of European power. Francis I, the new young king of France, desperately wanted to keep Mary in his court. Her presence legitimized his reign and provided a valuable bargaining chip in future negotiations with England. More personally, Francis was not immune to Mary's charms and harbored hopes that he might convince her to marry one of his allies, cementing French control over her considerable dowry and political influence. The Queen Dowager possesses beauty that could launch 1,000 ships and wealth that could finance 100 wars, Francis confided to his sister Marguerite. We cannot allow such a prize to escape back to England. She must be persuaded to remain in France, by whatever means necessary, but Mary had no intention of becoming a pawn in French politics. The months of her marriage to Louis XII had taught her valuable lessons about the ruthless nature of royal power, and she was determined never again to be sacrificed for political convenience. Her husband's death had given her something no royal woman of her era had ever possessed, the freedom to choose her own destiny. The challenge was surviving long enough to exercise that freedom. French law required Mary to remain in the country for a specific mourning period to ensure she wasn't carrying Louis's heir. If she was pregnant, the child would have a legitimate claim to the French throne, making Mary the most important woman in Europe. If she wasn't pregnant, she was still valuable as a potential bride for French allies. Mary's solution was masterful in its deception. She publicly embraced her role as the grieving widow, wearing black mourning dress, attending memorial services for her dead husband, and expressing appropriate sorrow for France's loss. Privately, she was planning the most audacious escape in royal history, the coded correspondence. The secret communication between Mary and Brandon had begun within days of Louis XII's death. Using a network of loyal English servants and sympathetic French courtiers, they had established a system of coded letters that allowed them to plan their future while maintaining the facade of proper diplomatic relations. Mary's letters revealed a woman transformed by her brief taste of independence. Gone was the dutiful princess who had accepted her marriage to an elderly French king without protest. In her place was a determined woman who understood exactly what she wanted and was prepared to risk everything to achieve it. My dearest friend, she wrote in one letter, using the careful language that would appear innocent to censors, I find myself in need of the most trusted counselor to guide me through these troubled waters. The path ahead requires not just wisdom, but courage of the highest order. I pray you will come to me with all the speed your friendship allows. Brandon's responses were equally careful, but unmistakably passionate. Though written in the formal language of diplomatic correspondence, they contained messages that could be read on multiple levels. Your Majesty's request for counsel touches my heart with the deepest concern for your welfare. I am prepared to undertake any service, however dangerous, that might secure your happiness and honor. No sacrifice would be too great to ensure your safe return to those who value you above all earthly treasures. modern historians examining these letters note the sophisticated encoding system they employed. References to counseling meant marriage planning. Safe return indicated elopement. Earthly treasures was their code for the love they dared not name directly. Henry's dangerous trust, meanwhile. In London, King Henry VIII was dealing with a complex diplomatic crisis created by his sister's situation. The French were demanding guarantees about Mary's future. Other European powers were seeking to exploit the uncertainty, and Henry's own court was divided about how to proceed. Henry's solution seemed logical. Send his most trusted friend and capable diplomat to negotiate Mary's return. Charles Brandon possessed all the qualities needed for such a delicate mission. He was charming enough to manage the French court, clever enough to outmaneuver diplomatic opponents, and loyal enough to be trusted with England's most precious royal asset. What Henry didn't understand was that he was sending Brandon on an impossible mission. The king expected his friend to convince Mary to return to England for another political marriage, while Brandon knew that Mary would rather die than submit to another arranged union with a stranger. The Duke of Suffolk departs for France with our complete confidence, Henry wrote to his council. His loyalty to the crown and affection for our royal sister ensure that he will act only in England's best interests. We expect his swift return with the Queen Dowager, ready to consider new alliances that will strengthen our realm. The tragic irony was that Henry genuinely believed he was acting in Mary's best interests. In his mind, bringing her back to England meant rescuing her from foreign intrigue and restoring her to the safety of family protection. He couldn't conceive that his sister might prefer independence to security, or love to political advantage. Thomas Wolsey, Henry's chief minister, was less sanguine about the mission. His sharp political instincts detected undercurrents in the situation that troubled him deeply. I fear we may be sending the Duke into circumstances that will test more than his diplomatic skills, Wolsey confided to his secretary. The Queen Dowager has been transformed by her experiences in France. She may not prove as tractable as His Majesty expects. The reunion in Paris. Brandon arrived in Paris on February 20th, 1515, and was immediately granted an audience with Mary at the Hôtel de Cluny, where she was maintaining her official residence as Dowager Queen. The public meeting was conducted with perfect diplomatic protocol, with Brandon presenting Henry's letters and Mary responding with appropriate expressions of sisterly affection and royal gratitude. But witnesses noted the electrical tension between the two English nobles. Despite their careful adherence to courtly formality, there was something in their manner that suggested deeper emotions barely held in check. The Duke of Suffolk and the Queen Dowager conducted themselves with irreproachable propriety, reported the Venetian ambassador. Yet there was an undercurrent of intensity that made their interview remarkable. One had the impression of watching actors performing roles while their real drama played out beneath the surface. The private reunion, which took place later that evening in Mary's secured chambers, was far different. After months of separation and years of suppressed desire, Mary and Brandon finally had the opportunity to speak freely about their feelings and their future. Mary had matured dramatically during her months in France. The sheltered princess who had left England had been replaced by a confident woman who understood both the value of power and the price of freedom. She spoke to Brandon not as a supplicant seeking rescue, but as an equal proposing a partnership. Charles," she said, using his given name for the first time in their relationship. "I have learned that royal blood means nothing without the courage to spill it for what matters most. I will not return to England to be bartered away like a prize cow at market. If you love me as your letters suggest, then help me claim the only happiness I will ever know." Brandon's response revealed the depth of his own transformation. The ambitious courtier who had risen through Henry's favor was prepared to risk everything he had gained for the woman he loved. "Mary, I have served your brother faithfully for years, but my loyalty to him cannot exceed my devotion to you. If you are truly willing to defy convention and court disaster for our happiness, then I am your servant in this as in all things." The secret wedding? What happened next shocked even the participants with its audacity. Rather than planning a careful return to England, followed by negotiations for a marriage, Mary and Brandon decided to wed immediately in France, presenting their families and governments with a fait accompli that could not be undone. The wedding took place on March 3, 1515, in a private chapel at the Hôtel de Cluny. The ceremony was conducted by an English chaplain who had been sworn to secrecy, with only a handful of witnesses present. Mary wore a simple white gown rather than the elaborate royal regalia that would have marked a state wedding, while Brandon appeared in his finest court dress, but without the ceremonial trappings of his ducal rank. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but charged with unique meaning given their circumstances. When Mary promised to love, honor, and obey her husband, she was renouncing not just her independence, but her royal prerogatives. When Brandon vowed to protect and cherish his wife, he was accepting responsibility for defending her against the wrath of kings. "By the grace of God and the witness of these friends, I take you as my husband in defiance of all earthly powers that would separate us," Mary declared, improvising beyond the traditional vows. "No throne, no crown, no royal command shall part us from this day forward." Brandon's response was equally passionate. "I pledge my life, my honor, and my worldly goods to your protection and happiness. If this union costs us everything else we possess, it will still be the greatest treasure we could claim." The wedding feast was modest by royal standards, but rich in emotional significance. For perhaps the first time in her life, Mary was celebrating not as a princess performing her royal duty, but as a woman who had chosen her own destiny. The immediate consequences, the newlyweds understood that their secret was temporary. Within days or weeks, news of their marriage would reach the courts of Europe, triggering a diplomatic crisis that would reshape international relations. They used their brief honeymoon period to prepare for the storm they knew was coming. Mary liquidated as much of her French assets as possible, converting property and jewelry into portable wealth that could be easily transported. Brandon used his diplomatic credentials to secure safe passage arrangements and establish contact with potential allies who might shelter them if they were forced to flee. Most importantly, they crafted a strategy for dealing with Henry's inevitable rage. Rather than attempting to hide their marriage indefinitely, they decided to return to England and face the king's wrath directly, gambling that Henry's love for his sister and friendship with Brandon would ultimately outweigh his anger at their deception. "We cannot live in exile forever," Mary argued. "Our only hope lies in throwing ourselves on Henry's mercy and trusting that blood and friendship will prove stronger than political calculation." It was a desperate gamble, but it was their only realistic option. As newlyweds, they had gained the right to happiness, but they had lost the protection of royal favor and diplomatic immunity. Their future depended entirely on whether love could triumph over the inexorable machinery of Tudor power. The secret was out, the die was cast, and the greatest royal scandal of the Renaissance was about to explode across Europe. The question now was whether Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon would survive the consequences of their passionate defiance. March 15th, 1515, Greenwich Palace, England, 6 a.m. King Henry VIII received the news of his sister's secret marriage while breaking his fast in his private chambers. The messenger, still dust-covered from his frantic ride from Dover, knelt trembling before the most powerful monarch in Europe as he delivered words that would send the Tudor court into chaos. "Your Majesty, the Duke of Suffolk and the Queen Dowager have wed in France without your Majesty's consent." The silence that followed was more terrifying than any royal rage. Henry's face drained of color, his massive hands slowly crushing the bread he had been eating, his small eyes narrowing to slits that promised death to someone, anyone, who could be blamed for this unthinkable betrayal. Then, with a roar that shook the palace walls, the King of England exploded in the most violent fury of his reign. Have you ever witnessed the moment when absolute power collides with ultimate betrayal? That morning at Greenwich Palace, as Henry VIII learned that his most beloved sister and closest friend had committed the ultimate act of defiance, the foundations of Tudor authority cracked so violently that the tremors would be felt for generations. What made this betrayal so devastating wasn't just the political damage, it was the personal wound that cut deeper than any sword. Henry had trusted Charles Brandon with his kingdom, his secrets, and his sister's safety. In return, Brandon had stolen the king's most precious possession and dared to claim it as his own. The explosion of royal rage Henry's initial response to the news was so violent that courtiers feared for their lives. The king swept everything from his table in a tremendous crash of breaking crockery, then began smashing furniture with his bare hands. His roars of rage could be heard throughout the palace, sending servants fleeing and nobles barricading themselves in their chambers. Treason! Treason! By God's blood, they shall both die for this. Henry bellowed, his voice cracking with emotion. He has stolen my sister like a common thief. She has betrayed her blood like a whore. They shall burn. They shall both burn. Thomas Wolsey, summoned urgently to deal with the crisis, found his king in a state unlike anything he had witnessed in years of service. Henry was pacing like a caged animal, alternately weeping with betrayal and howling with rage, his face purple with apoplectic fury. "Your Majesty," Wolsey began carefully, "perhaps we should consider what?" Henry whirled on his chief minister with blazing eyes. "My sister has made me a laughingstock before all of Europe. My closest friend has betrayed my trust in the most vile manner possible. There is nothing to consider except the manner of their deaths." The king's rage was so intense that several courtiers collapsed from sheer terror. This was not the calculated anger Henry often displayed for political effect. This was raw, primal fury that threatened to consume everything in its path. What made the situation even more dangerous was Henry's sense of personal humiliation. He had sent Brandon to France specifically to retrieve Mary, trusting his friend's loyalty and competence. Instead, Brandon had used Henry's own authority to steal the king's sister and marry her in defiance of royal prerogative. The political earthquake news of Mary's secret marriage spread through European courts with stunning speed, creating a diplomatic crisis that threatened to reshape the balance of continental power. Every royal family understood the implications. If Tudor princesses could marry for love without royal consent, the entire system of political alliances was in jeopardy. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V wrote to his ambassador in London, "This English madness threatens the very foundations of royal authority. If Henry cannot control his own sister, how can he be trusted to honor agreements involving other royal marriages? We must reconsider all pending negotiations with England." Pope Leo X was equally alarmed, though for different reasons. The Church had officiated at Mary's marriage to Louis XII and would be required to recognize her new union with Brandon. The speed with which she had moved from one husband to another raised uncomfortable questions about the validity of royal marriages and the Church's role in political alliances. The English princess has created a scandal that reaches to the very gates of heaven, the Pope confided to his secretary. How can we explain to Christian Europe that a queen can discard one husband's memory so quickly for another man's bed? This threatens the sanctity of marriage itself. Francis I of France was perhaps the most furious of all foreign rulers. He had lost a valuable political asset when Mary escaped his court, and her marriage to an English duke eliminated any possibility of using her for French diplomatic purposes. "The English have made fools of us all," Francis raged to his council. "We welcomed their princess as our queen, mourned our king's death, and offered her royal protection. In return, she has fled like a thief in the night with their ambassador. This insult cannot stand." The return of the fugitives while European courts reeled from the scandal. Mary and Brandon were making their desperate journey back to England. They had chosen to face Henry's wrath directly rather than live in permanent exile, but both understood that they might be sailing toward their own executions. The Channel crossing was turbulent, both meteorologically and emotionally. Mary, now the Duchess of Suffolk by virtue of her marriage, spent much of the voyage violently seasick, whether from the rough waters or from terror at what awaited them in England. "Charles," she said, during one of their few private moments aboard ship, "I fear we have purchased our happiness at too dear a price. If Henry orders our deaths, will you regret choosing love over loyalty?" Brandon's response revealed the depth of his commitment. "Mary, I would rather die as your husband than live forever as the king's faithful lapdog. If we face the scaffold together, at least we face it as equals in love." Their ship reached Dover on March 20th, and word of their arrival was immediately sent to Greenwich Palace. Henry's response was swift and ominous. Both Mary and Brandon were to be escorted to the Tower of London under armed guard, pending the king's pleasure. The journey from Dover to London became a parade of shame. Crowds gathered to witness the disgrace of the royal sister who had defied her king for love. Some spectators showed sympathy for the romantic rebels, but most were horrified by their defiance of royal authority. To see a Tudor princess being escorted to the Tower like a common criminal was a sight that chilled the blood, wrote a contemporary observer. Yet the Duchess bore herself with such dignity that even her enemies could not help but admire her courage. The Tower imprisonment Mary and Brandon were lodged in separate quarters within the Tower of London. comfortable by prison standards, but unmistakably cells nonetheless. For the first time since their marriage, they were completely separated and at the mercy of Henry's justice. The symbolism was not lost on anyone. The Tower was where Henry had sent his enemies to await execution, where royal traitors met their fate, where the machinery of Tudor justice ground the bones of those who defied the crown. That Mary Tudor, sister to the king, was imprisoned there sent shockwaves through the nobility. Mary's quarters were in the same section where she had once stayed before Henry's coronation, adding bitter irony to her situation. The rooms that had once housed her in triumph now confined her in disgrace. She spent her days writing letters pleading for mercy, and her nights praying for deliverance. Brandon, meanwhile, was lodged in the quarters traditionally reserved for noble prisoners awaiting trial. He understood that his life hung by the thinnest of threads. Henry's friendship was the only thing standing between him and the executioners. Locke, the most painful aspect of their imprisonment, was the complete separation from each other. After risking everything to be together, they were now prevented from even communicating. Guards watched them constantly, and any attempt to send messages between their quarters was immediately reported to the king. The trial of Love Henry. Escort was divided on how to handle the crisis. Some advisers urged immediate execution as an example to other potential rebels. Others argued for mercy, pointing out that Mary was still the king's sister, and Brandon had served the crown faithfully for years. Thomas Wolsey emerged as the voice of pragmatic moderation. He understood that executing Mary would create a permanent scandal and might turn public opinion against the king. Similarly, killing Brandon would eliminate one of England's most capable military commanders at a time when the kingdom faced external threats. Your Majesty, Wolsey argued in private council, the damage is done and cannot be undone. Execution will only compound the scandal and make martyrs of the guilty parties. Perhaps mercy tempered with punishment would better serve the crown's interests. Henry's response revealed the depth of his internal conflict. They have wounded me in my very soul, Thomas. How can I show mercy to those who have betrayed my trust so completely? Yet how can I destroy my own sister and my dearest friend? I am torn between justice and love, and I know not which should prevail. The king's torment was genuine. He had loved Mary more than any of his siblings, and had trusted Brandon more than any other courtier. Their betrayal had shattered his faith in human loyalty, and left him questioning his own judgment. The impossible dilemma. As days passed, Henry found himself trapped in an impossible situation. His royal dignity demanded severe punishment for such unprecedented defiance. His personal feelings made the thought of executing Mary and Brandon almost unbearable. His political needs required a solution that would restore royal authority without creating permanent enemies. The European implications were equally complex. Executing Mary would send a message that England valued royal prerogative above all else, but it would also demonstrate that English kings were willing to kill their own family members for political reasons. Other rulers might see this as strength or as dangerous instability. Public opinion was similarly divided. Many subjects were scandalized by Mary's defiance and expected severe punishment. Others were charmed by the romantic nature of her rebellion and hoped for royal mercy. The king's decision would be seen as a reflection of his character and his fitness to rule. His Majesty walks the palace halls like a man tormented by demons, reported the Venetian ambassador. He speaks little, eats less, and seems aged beyond his years. The burden of deciding his sister's fate has taken a terrible toll on his spirit. The seeds of compromise by early April. It became clear that Henry was seeking a solution that would satisfy justice without requiring execution. Wolsey and other advisers worked frantically to craft a punishment that would restore royal dignity while preserving royal blood. The emerging compromise involved massive financial penalties, temporary exile from court, and public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Mary and Brandon would keep their lives but lose their wealth and status. It was a solution that satisfied no one completely, but offered something to all parties. Henry's struggle with this decision revealed the complexity of his character. The same man who could order the execution of wives and ministers found himself unable to destroy his sister and friend. Despite their unprecedented betrayal, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic royal pardons in English history, a moment when love would triumph over law, mercy over justice, and family bonds over political calculation. But the price of that mercy would reshape the Tudor court forever. May 12, 1515, Greenwich Palace, the throne room. King Henry VIII sat upon his throne like a man aged a decade and 2 months, his once confident bearing replaced by the weary posture of a monarch who had learned that even absolute power could not heal the wounds of personal betrayal. Before him knelt his sister Mary and Charles Brandon, both pale and thin from their imprisonment in the Tower, awaiting the judgment that would determine whether love had triumphed over royal authority, or whether they would pay the ultimate price for their defiance. The great hall was packed with nobles, ambassadors, and court officials, all desperate to witness the resolution of the greatest royal scandal in living memory. The silence was so complete that the sound of Henry's breathing was audible throughout the chamber as he prepared to deliver a verdict that would define his reign and reshape the Tudor dynasty forever. When the king finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual thunder. Instead, it held the quiet authority of a man who had wrestled with his demons and emerged transformed. "Rise, Mary Tudor Brandon, Duchess of Suffolk. Rise, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk. You have committed crimes against the crown that merit death, yet you remain my blood and my friend. Today we shall see whether mercy can coexist with justice." The verdict that shocked Europe. Henry's decision to spare Mary and Brandon's lives sent shockwaves throughout European courts that had been expecting executions. The king, who had built his reputation on ruthless enforcement of royal prerogative, had chosen to forgive the most flagrant act of defiance in Tudor history. But mercy came with a price that would bankrupt the couple and exile them from the centers of power they had once dominated. "You shall live," Henry declared, his voice growing stronger as he outlined their punishment. "But your lives shall serve as a lesson to all who would place personal desire above royal command. You have chosen love over loyalty, so be it. But you shall learn that love alone cannot sustain those who have forfeited their sovereign's favor." The financial penalties were devastating. Brandon was required to repay Mary's entire dowry from her marriage to Louis XII, a sum equivalent to £24,000, representing nearly half the annual income of the English crown. Additionally, he had to surrender his most valuable estates and accept a dramatic reduction in his ducal income, Mary faced her own punishments. She forfeited all the French pension rights she had gained as Louis XII's widow, lost her claim to valuable properties in both England and France, and was stripped of many of the ceremonial privileges that came with her royal blood. The Duke and Duchess of Suffolk shall pay to our treasury the sum of £1,000 annually for the remainder of their natural lives, Henry continued, as recompense for the damage their actions have inflicted upon the Crown's dignity and England's international standing. But perhaps the most painful punishment was their temporary banishment from court. For two people who had spent their entire lives at the center of royal power, exile to their country estates was a form of living death. They would be permitted to attend major state occasions, but forbidden from participating in the daily life of the court that had shaped their identities. The hidden wisdom of royal Mercy Henry's decision to spare Mary and Brandon revealed a political sophistication that surprised many observers. By choosing mercy over execution, he achieved several strategic objectives that pure vengeance could never have accomplished. First, he demonstrated that Tudor justice could be both firm and compassionate, distinguishing his reign from the arbitrary brutality that characterized many European monarchies. This enhanced his reputation as a king who valued family bonds and personal loyalty, even when enforcing royal prerogative. Second, he avoided creating martyrs whose deaths might have inspired further acts of defiance. Mary and Brandon, alive but impoverished, served as more effective warnings than Mary and Brandon dead and romanticized by popular memory. Third, he preserved his sister's potential value for future diplomatic negotiations. A living Mary Tudor could still be useful in international relations, even if her secret marriage had complicated her status. A dead Mary would have been politically worthless and diplomatically embarrassing. Thomas Wolsey, who had advocated for mercy throughout the crisis, privately praised Henry's wisdom. His Majesty has shown that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to preserve what has value while correcting what has gone wrong. The Duke and Duchess live, but they live as permanent reminders of the consequences of defying royal will. The personal cost of forgiveness, however, Henry's mercy came with emotional costs that would affect him for the rest of his life. The easy trust he had once placed in others was permanently damaged. Never again would he allow himself to be as vulnerable to personal betrayal as he had been with Mary and Brandon. His relationship with Mary, while preserved, was forever changed. The sister who had once been his closest confidant became a more distant figure, always aware that her life depended on the king's continued goodwill. Their correspondence, once warm and intimate, became formal and careful. I observe that His Majesty speaks to the Duchess of Suffolk with perfect courtesy, but without the warmth he once showed, noted the Spanish ambassador. It is as if he has placed a barrier around his heart that even family blood cannot completely penetrate. Brandon's friendship with Henry suffered even more dramatic changes. While the king continued to employ his military skills and political expertise, their personal relationship never recovered its former intimacy. Brandon remained a valued servant, but ceased to be a trusted friend. The psychological impact on Henry was profound. A king who had believed in the absolute loyalty of those closest to him learned that even blood and friendship could be subordinated to personal desire. This lesson would influence his treatment of future wives, ministers, and family members, contributing to the paranoid suspicion that characterized his later reign. The exile years, love and poverty Mary, and Brandon's early married life was marked by financial struggle that would have been unimaginable during their court years. Exiled to Brandon's estates in Suffolk, they lived as minor country nobility rather than great figures of state, constantly aware that their reduced circumstances were the price of their romantic rebellion. The irony was bitter. They had gained the right to be together, but lost almost everything else that had defined their identities. Mary, who had been raised in royal luxury, learned to manage a modest household budget. Brandon, who had commanded armies and influenced kings, found himself concerned with crop yields and local politics. Yet contemporary accounts suggest that despite their reduced circumstances, Mary and Brandon found genuine happiness in their exile. Free from the constant political pressures of court life, they were able to build a relationship based on shared affection rather than strategic calculation. The Duke and Duchess of Suffolk appear remarkably content with their rustic existence, wrote a visitor to their Suffolk estate in 1517. They maintain a pleasant household, take obvious delight in each other's company, and seem to have found compensations for their political disgrace that their enemies cannot understand. Their marriage produced 4 children, including 2 sons who would restore some measure of the family's political influence in later generations. The domestic happiness they achieved stood in marked contrast to the sterile political marriages that dominated royal circles. The transformation of Tudor politics, the Mary Tudor scandal, had lasting effects on how the Tudor dynasty approached marriage and family relationships. Henry's experience with his sister's defiance made him increasingly suspicious of allowing royal family members any degree of independence in choosing spouses. Future royal marriages were planned with even greater attention to political advantage and even less consideration for personal preference. The lesson Henry drew from Mary's rebellion was not that love should be valued, but that it should be more carefully controlled. This change in approach would have tragic consequences for Henry's own children. His daughter Mary I would suffer through an arranged marriage to Philip II of Spain that brought her little happiness. His daughter Elizabeth I would ultimately choose to remain unmarried, rather than submit to political matches that might compromise her authority. The broader English nobility also learned from the scandal. While Mary and Brandon had ultimately survived their defiance, the financial and social costs served as effective deterrents to similar acts of romantic rebellion. Royal marriage remained a tool of statecraft rather than an expression of personal choice. The European legacy that ensures the resolution of the Mary Tudor scandal established important precedents for how European monarchs would handle similar crises in the future. Henry's combination of mercy and punishment became a model for dealing with family members who defied royal authority for personal reasons. Other rulers noted that Henry had managed to preserve his sister's life while still demonstrating the consequences of defying royal will. This approach offered a middle path between the extremes of total forgiveness and complete destruction that would influence royal justice throughout the 16th century. The scandal also contributed to changing attitudes toward marriage and royal prerogative. While political marriages remained the norm, The Mary Tudor case demonstrated that even royal authority had limits when confronted with genuine passion and personal determination. The final reckoning. Mary Tudor and Charles Brandon's secret marriage ultimately achieved something unprecedented in royal history. It proved that love could survive even when it challenged the most fundamental assumptions about royal power and family loyalty. They paid an enormous price for their happiness, but they kept both their lives and their relationship. Henry VIII learned that mercy could be more powerful than vengeance, but he also discovered that forgiveness came with its own costs. The easy trust and intimate relationships that had characterized his early reign were permanently damaged by his sister's betrayal. The Tudor dynasty survived the scandal but was forever changed by it. The family that had built its power on careful political marriages learned that even the most controlled royal bloodlines could produce individuals willing to sacrifice everything for love. In the end, Mary Tudor's rebellion against royal authority established her as one of history's great romantic figures, a princess who chose personal happiness over political duty and somehow managed to survive the consequences. Her story became a template for countless later tales of forbidden love triumphing over social convention. The scandal that once threatened to destroy the Tudor dynasty ultimately demonstrated its resilience and Henry VIII's capacity for growth as both a king and a human being. It was a lesson in the complex relationship between power and mercy, duty and love, that would resonate through English history for centuries to come. The Queen's secret marriage had indeed shattered the Tudor court, but from the pieces, something stronger and more human had emerged.